Mayor de Blasio says coastlines in New York City aren't protected from storm disasters like Hurricane Sandy. Now he is joining local officials and climate scientists at the Metropolitan College of New York in Lower Manhattan to discuss a storm protection plan for the area. Let's listen in.
The third report of the NPCC will be formally released tomorrow. And what we can sort of bring forward are some sort of main focus points of it. Primarily, we're sort of looking at this question of the implications of climate change in the context of every day and providing tools and methods that the city can use to better understand the conditions of change, the projections, and also how to assess the implications of these changes. The focus of the report also integrates questions of community engagement, and bringing these issues of climate change beyond questions of infrastructure and some of the other points of focus for earlier assessments, but into the neighborhoods of New York. A third element is sort of providing more specific details with respect to some of these tools and methods. One, as example, is a prototype on climate change resilience indicators and monitoring system. And here we see the cover of the report, which will be available as part of a 10th anniversary summit on climate change and the work of the NPCC. This will be available and released more formally at that event. This is just a few doors from here, the New York Academy of Sciences. In the afternoon tomorrow, there'll be a series of panels and presentations integrating and illustrating the connection between science and practice, both in the context of the city of New York and what the implications of this work internationally. And also it'll be sort of a recognition, as was noted, of the more than 10 years now of work of the NPCC and the importance that this climate science has had on the everyday understanding of these issues in the city, and also for the development of public policy. Thank you.
You also need height.
Yeah. Good morning. I am Janie Bavishi, and I'm the director of the Mayor's Office of Recovery and Resiliency. First of all, I want to thank the New York City Panel on Climate Change for 10 years of tireless work. Special thanks to Bill and Cynthia, our NPCC co-chairs. The NPCC's findings are the foundation for all we're doing to build a stronger, more resilient city. We're excited to participate in and we look forward to continued engagement with the NPCC and the full scientific community on the issues that are most vital to our future. We're here today to talk about climate change. The challenge we face is unprecedented. In New York City, it is an existential threat, as Hurricane Sandy so dramatically illustrated. Sandy devastated our city, from the Rockaways to Staten Island to Brooklyn. Right here in Lower Manhattan, the damage was extensive. The power went out, plunging us into darkness. Water poured into homes, businesses, and tunnels. The destruction was unlike anything we have seen before. Sandy was a turning point. Across the city, we began advancing bold solutions and reconsidering our relationship to the water. And we quickly realized that there is no silver bullet to the risks that we face. And that's why we're implementing a multi-layered strategy in all 5 boroughs. We're working on different timescales, recognizing that the largest and most complicated projects can take many years to study and design, and we're not wasting any time on the projects we can implement now. We're developing unprecedented solutions to these unprecedented problems. We are spending tens of billions of dollars to make New Yorkers safer and more resilient. You can see here a map of New York City's coastal protection projects. These are essential to reimagining our waterfront in the face of climate change and safeguarding us from the next storm. We have already completed a fully constructed Rockaway Boardwalk, which sets a new standard for resilient design. We are working closely with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Together, we have already built nearly 10 miles of dunes in Staten Island and on the Rockaway Peninsula. And just last month, we secured $615 million of funding for the Staten Island Levee project. The Build It Back program has rebuilt and elevated thousands of homes. Now those families are safer than they have ever been. We're also making sure that climate projections are reflected in how the city plans and invests. And that's only a small fraction of the work that we are doing. The science tells us that stronger storms are only one of the threats we face, which is why we're preparing for heat waves, which are the city's deadliest extreme weather event. More intense precipitation, which will cause more flooding, including in our inland communities, and the chronic effects of sea level rise on our 520 miles of coastline, as well as other emerging climate threats. All of this work is critical to our future. It's ambitious, it will span generations, and we're doing it so that our city can continue to thrive. The impacts we face in 2050 are severe, and at this point, 2050 is within the span of a home mortgage. In 2100, climate impacts will be even more dire. A child born today will likely see those impacts play out. And as a new parent, I think about that every day. One thing is certain, we don't have time to waste. Now, as we look to the future, I'm going to turn it over to Mayor de Blasio, who has an exciting announcement to make about Lower Manhattan. Thank you.
Thank you, Janie, and thank you for your good work and all your colleagues' good work to prepare us for this day when we come to grips with some of the things that we are facing in this city and prepare for the future. Also, I want to say to Janie, extra credit for taking time from your parental leave to join us, and we really appreciate that above and beyond. Let's thank Janie for all she has been doing. So we have been focused over these last 5 years on making this city more resilient. And any of us who went through Hurricane Sandy, we understood why we had to do that. It wasn't an idea, it wasn't an abstraction, it was very personal, it was very human for all of us who saw the destruction and the pain caused by Sandy. Let's remember what happened. 44 New Yorkers killed. Thousands and thousands lost their homes and were displaced. $19 billion in devastation. I often said after Sandy, you don't find a lot of climate change deniers in New York City. For us, it was a fact. It was something we knew was now part of our lives. So this is the existential threat. This is the core issue we all must face as aggressively as humanly possible. New York City is addressing global warming in many, many ways. And today we announce a plan unlike anything that has been done before in terms of its scope, in terms of its impact. This is a plan that will protect Lower Manhattan for the remainder of this century, all the way to 2100 and, in fact, beyond. I want to thank everyone who's worked on this effort, starting with the co-chairs of the New York City Panel on Climate Change. Again, a thanks to Dr. Cynthia Rosenzweig of Columbia University and Dr. Bill Selecki of Hunter College for the hard work they and their colleagues put in. I want to thank, while I'm at it, talking about good folks from academia, our host, Dr. Joanne Passaro, president of Metropolitan College. And our partners in this work, so many key leaders, civic leaders, business leaders, community leaders understand that we have to get it right this time. So a real thanks to the president and CEO of the Partnership for New York City, Kathy Wild. Thank you. To B.J. Jones, the president and CEO of the Battery Park City Authority. Thank you. And to Jessica Lappin, president of the Downtown Alliance. Thank you so much. After Sandy, I toured neighborhoods of this city, and I remember vividly being in Lower Manhattan and seeing the destruction and seeing the impact of the flooding and seeing people's lives totally upended. Businesses destroyed, homes destroyed. People felt very vulnerable. They felt a lot of fear. They felt that something had happened that they couldn't fathom. For days, you'll remember in Lower Manhattan, there were people who did not have food, did not have electricity, couldn't get enough water. This happened in recent memory. And if you ever wanted to use the phrase wake-up call, there it was. Now, global warming is an extraordinary threat to all of our country, all of our Earth. But when it comes to New York City, one of the great coastal cities of the world, we are particularly threatened. And nowhere is that threat greater than for the hundreds of thousands of people who live and work in Lower Manhattan. We've been looking at different solutions. And we had to come to grips with the sheer magnitude of what had to be done and the challenge of making it happen in real terms. Because remember, we're talking about a neighborhood, a living, breathing, active neighborhood where so much has been done for centuries. And our job was to protect that neighborhood, but also recognize that we couldn't disrupt so much that happens there. We also had to think about what would ultimately work against a wide variety of threats. It's not just a superstorm that we fear. It's rising sea levels. It's a host of other challenges that could lead to making this an area that simply isn't livable. You're going to hear from the President of the Economic Development Corporation, James Patchett, in just a moment on some of the details. But let me give you the headlines now. We will initiate an effort that is estimated to cost $10 billion to extend the shoreline of Lower Manhattan into the East River to protect the Seaport area and the financial district and all the people who live and work there. And we are already investing $500 million in 4 projects to strengthen the Lower Manhattan coastline and provide interim protections. All 4 of those projects will be under construction in the next 2 years. There will be installation of temporary barriers put in place this year, by the end of this summer, in the area around 2 bridges, the financial district, and the Seaport, to protect us this year from this coming hurricane season. Now, this Lower Manhattan Coastal Resiliency Plan is comprehensive, to say the least. It is audacious, but most of all, it is necessary. This is a very, very big undertaking. There's nothing been done like this in the history of New York City, but it is needed. And I want to give you the plain facts that make so clear why we have to do this. This is a city with 4.5 million jobs. 1 in 10 of the jobs in this city are located in Lower Manhattan. 75% of the subway lines in New York City run through Lower Manhattan. There's $60 billion worth of property in Lower Manhattan. As I said, hundreds of thousands of people who live or work there every day. Now, the next point I'm going to make should be something that's talked about not only here, but in our nation's capital. Lower Manhattan is one of the core centers of the American economy, is where the financial capital of the United States is. The security of Lower Manhattan should be a national priority. The fact is, it is not. And it's incomprehensible to me that there's no sense of urgency from the federal government, and there hasn't been, to protect Lower Manhattan and all it means, not only for this city and state, but for this country. Here's the stark reality. Federal funds only come after there's been a disaster. That is the reality of our country right now. There's no plan, there's no vision, there's no funding to actually protect us from what is looming in our future. It's only when the destruction has been done that money eventually starts to flow. We can't live that way anymore. I want to give you an example for anyone who may be thinking right now, well, I just told you about a single initiative that's going to cost $10 billion. Someone might say, well, how on earth are we going to afford this? Here's a fact. From the years of the Iraq War, the United States spent an average of $50 billion a year on that war and did not spend money protecting Americans from global warming. We have to get our priorities right. In the meantime, we have to go at the root cause. To say the least, we would like our national government to focus more on how to stop global warming. But in the meantime, the city of New York is doing all we can, and cities all over the country, over 400 cities, have pledged to live up to the standards of the Paris Agreement. We are cutting emissions 80% by 2050. We're the first major American city to divest our pension fund dollars from fossil fuels companies. That's going to be a $5 billion divestment. We're committed to investing 2% of all of our pension fund money in renewable energy. That's going to be a $4 billion investment. We are doing the things that are needed, but they'll have to be done on a much greater scale, literally, if we are all to survive. We can't afford to bury our head in the sand, and that's right now what our federal government is doing. But we understand we have to make a difference, and we have to advocate for the big and bold changes needed. I believe in the Green New Deal. I believe in the sweep and scope. I believe that we have to fundamentally change our lives and our approach to our economy. We have to become a low-carbon economy as quickly as possible. We have to invest money in renewable energy on a much greater scale, and as part of that Green New Deal, there has to be a huge federal initiative to protect the coastal areas of this country and the tens of millions of people who live there. By the way, all of that will create a huge number of jobs that working people need. So in the meantime, we don't just sit around and have wishful thinking about our federal government getting the memo. We are acting. And this plan is how we protect one of the single most sensitive areas of our city and our nation before it's too late. A few words in Spanish. Hoy anunciamos un plan nunca visto para proteger al Bajo Manhattan del cambio climático. Vamos a construir nuevas barreras y a extender la costa en áreas vulnerables para protegerlas de inundaciones. Necesitamos que el gobierno federal deje de ignorar y haga frente a esta crisis. Mientras tanto, vamos a seguir haciendo todo lo posible para proteger a nuestra gente y nuestra ciudad. With that, I want to bring forward the president of the Economic Development Corporation, James Patchett. He and his team have worked very intensely to come up with a plan that will work, no matter how ambitious, no matter how challenging. This is a plan that will actually protect Lower Manhattan. I want to thank him and his team. James Patchett.
I don't need this step. All right. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you to our scientist friends for being here and for showing so much leadership on this for more than a decade. And thank you also to Kathy and Jessica for being here. It means a lot to see the business community here, Lower Manhattan community here, recognizing what an important issue this is for the future of our city. I also want to just take a moment to second what the mayor said about Janie, who is technically still on maternity leave. As the parent of 2 children under the age of 5, and having been on a number of conference calls with her recently, hearing the baby crying in the background, just want to say it says a lot that she's here today, so thank you. That's right. I would clap for my wife if she were at a press conference during her maternity leave, although then I'd be at home. Okay, so as the mayor mentioned, this comprehensive resiliency plan will invest over $500 million in projects that protect about 70% of the Lower Manhattan coastline. These projects are all beginning design today and will be in construction by 2021. I want to take a moment to walk you through each of these projects in a little bit more detail. First, I want to start with Battery Park City. So the city has already approved $134 million in borrowing authority for Battery Park City. So this is a resiliency plan for Battery Park City, and the design aims to integrate flood protection into the existing landscape. The design process is underway, and this is going to guarantee protection against both a storm surge and sea level rise, 2 of the biggest threats to the Battery Park City level as sea level rise increases. So the Battery Park City Authority, as I mentioned here today, have already kicked off the design process. We're working closely with them, and we anticipate they will begin construction on this within the next year, or I should say next year. Moving around south and east to the Battery Park, which is just next to Battery Park City. It's key that we have a comprehensive solution that covers all of the elements of Lower Manhattan, and this is the next element. So we know how vulnerable the battery is to storm surge after what happened during Hurricane Sandy. Both the wharf and the esplanade were badly damaged, and it also provides an entryway for water to come into Lower Manhattan if this area is not also protected. So this project will protect the park against rising sea levels and provide coastal protection for the neighborhood behind it. It's a $165 million project, and it will reconstruct and raise the wharf and the esplanade to protect against higher sea levels. And we're also going to build an elevated and protected barrier at the back of the park. So it's a combined effort, one on the waterfront and one further back in the park. We're just beginning the design process here. We're going to work closely with the community on that. We haven't determined the final design. We know it needs to have those two elements as a part of it, but we are going to begin construction on this project by 2021. So moving on to two bridges, skipping past the Seaport for a moment. So here we're in the process of designing and building a $200 million system of flip-up barriers and flood walls that will protect this neighborhood and also preserve the waterfront. So the flip-up barriers are, what that means is they're deployable barriers that come up from underground in the event of a storm. When there isn't a storm, you won't even know that they're there. And here's an ominous picture of a storm showing the barriers flipped up, protecting the neighborhood. We're now finalizing the design, and we're going to continue to work with the community very closely in the coming months, and we will also begin construction on this project by 2021. So I want to move on to the most complicated area, which, as Janie noted, is the FIDI and the Seaport, which are also two of the most vulnerable neighborhoods in Lower Manhattan. That's why the city has been going through a process of exploring an exhaustive list of alternatives of ways to protect this area. So this has a unique combination of complex factors that makes it particularly challenging. It's infrastructure constraints, including both the battery tunnel and the AC tunnel, which are both passing directly under this area. It has low topography at about 8 feet above sea level, and so none of the known or existing strategies that we're using across the rest of this district are going to work here. But we don't have a choice. We know that we have to protect this community. The mayor referenced the amount of value this area represents for the city and the importance of it to our economy. We have to protect this area. So what are we doing? We're going through a comprehensive climate resilience master plan where we will create a specific plan in partnership with the community to extend the shoreline, which will give us space to construct the necessary infrastructure. We recognize that building in the water will be challenging, and we're treating this option as the absolute last resort. But our analysis has shown that an on-land solution like the one we're using at Two Bridges, which will reduce nearly half of the area that was originally proposed for shoreline extension in Seaport City, that solution is just not viable in this segment of the original Seaport City area. So this shoreline extension could extend anywhere from 50 feet to up to 500 feet, which is the pier head away from the existing coastline. But the bottom line is this is not just a visionary concept at this point. Our next step is to immediately procure a team of engineers and designers to work close partnership with the community to come up with a specific and viable design. By the end of our administration, in partnership with the community, we will have a comprehensive design for a first phase of this project and a clear implementation plan for the comprehensive solution for this segment, in addition to being in full construction on the other 70% of Lower Manhattan. But all of that being said, we know that we can't wait for another hurricane season for this most vulnerable part of Lower Manhattan. So that is why we're working in close partnership with emergency management to take action now. We'll be deploying HESCO barriers in portions of the Seaport and the financial district and the Two Bridges neighborhood. These tools are critical as storms become more frequent. So those will be permanently in place in advance of this coming hurricane season, and they will be accompanied by tiger dams, which are refillable dams that can be filled up with water in the event of an incoming storm, which will be placed in conjunction with the HESCO barriers in the event that we see a storm coming. So comprehensively, what we have is a plan to begin construction on full resiliency measures for 70% of Lower Manhattan, a plan to protect the remaining 30% before this next hurricane season, and a partnership with the community to determine a long-term solution to that remaining and most challenging part. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, James. So I want to just again express my appreciation to everyone who worked on this effort. This has taken a tremendous amount of research and rethinking of what is possible and what is needed. One of the things that's clear is this team understood, to quote from the great movie Apollo 13, that failure is not an option, that we had to find something that would work no matter how expensive or ambitious it was. And this is the plan that we believe can work, and we have to get to work on it right away. I want to say one more thing up front. This, again, should be a federal priority. This should be a case where the federal government is asking us how they can help and talking to us about the importance of protecting this crucial national asset. That's just not happening. I want everyone to understand that. That conversation is not happening. We have to do it ourselves in terms of getting things rolling. But we pray the day is near when our federal government actually creates a plan for national resiliency and funds it properly so that we can build these new protections with the kind of resources we really need. This is not something that people of New York City can handle on their own. This is something that deserves a national response, and we're going to keep working for that day. In the meantime, we're doing all we can to get the ball rolling so we can protect our people, our jobs, our subways, our communities. With that, I want to take questions from the media on this announcement. Yes.
Good morning, Mr. Mayor.
Good morning.
Congratulations on what sounds like a visionary, very ambitious plan. In terms of context, recent experience tells us that this community pushes back a lot when it feels like it has not been consulted, given the example of relocating the post-Rikers closure jail to Lower Manhattan. Fairly or unfairly, there's a sense that that process could have been handled better. Will it be handled differently and better in terms of design this time?
Look, this is going to be a major, major project. It's going to take years to get done. We expect to go through a full ULURP process, just as we are, by the way, with the jails. And I want to remind people that New York City does something a lot of other places don't do in this country. Through that ULURP process, we really engage communities as an opportunity for a lot of give and take, a lot of changes. Anyone who's watched sees that many, many ideas evolve and change during ULURP. But I also think if you talk to people in Lower Manhattan who suffered through Sandy, they don't want to see it happen again. I remember vividly talking to residents, talking to store owners. I remember being in people's stores that were absolutely destroyed. Folks, again, who couldn't get food, couldn't get water, they don't want to go through that again. So we believe, I believe people are really ultimately in these matters very thoughtful, intelligent. They understand that tough choices have to be made. But we'll go through that full discussion with the community.
Follow-up, if I may.
Please.
We're going to go 50 to 500 feet out. That raises the question of what's going to be on those decks, what's going to be in that landfill. How much of a voice will the community have in decisions about, is this going to be a park or a high-rise? Is this going to be a school versus a library?
It's the same point. Through a ULURP process, that's where all that gets determined. Now, this is where the federal question really comes into play. Let's imagine that for the next year to 2 years, we don't expect to see a revelation in Washington where suddenly there'll be huge interest in resiliency and funding it properly. Perhaps after 2020, there'll be a very different reality, and something like a Green New Deal moves forward with a major resiliency plank to it. That is what I would like to see, and that would mean there'd be a huge amount of federal funding, and that would allow us to have the ability to do these kind of barriers in a way that gives us the most flexibility. If we could fund it publicly, then we don't need to find private sources of funding. From the perspective of the city of New York alone, this would be extraordinarily difficult to fund. I think it comes down to simply this. If there's federal money in play, it probably looks one way. If there's not federal money in play, we have to get some private money into it, then there has to be some development. That to me is the dividing line. But that's an honest conversation that we can have with communities. Now, the usually punctual Gail Brewer has arrived. so let's break for 1 second if you're ready, or do you want a moment?
No, I can say.
All right, let's just have Gail, before we go to more questions, have Gail jump in and say, offer her thoughts.
I was hoping it was over. So,
That's one way to plan your schedule.
exactly. Anyway, I'm delighted to be here. I want to thank the mayor. I want to thank EDC and Mr. Padgett, because we just had a good briefing with EDC and others talking about how to deal with the lower Manhattan shoreline, and to the credit of the administration and HUD and others, most of it has been at least considered in terms of how are we going to be resilient. But there are some aspects, my beloved and the mayor's beloved South Street Seaport area. I've been fighting for that area for a long time. Yep. And of course, the financial district. So I think that we all remember Hurricane Sandy, and we know what all of the both storm surge and challenges of a hurricane or a water could also bring. So I think that there are some great plans that have been considered. I know that also want to thank Battery Park City, because they have not only come up with ideas, but they have been very instrumental in bringing the community into that discussion. And if you know Battery Park, they always have questions. So this is a good discussion to figure out how to deal with the sort of the area that has not been covered, and we're going to work on it together. Again, good discussions, lots of input, and I think that that's what robust community engagement is critical to the success of this or any other idea that moves forward, but we have certainly gotten off to a good start. And I'm very, very familiar with these challenges, because I was actually there when Sean Donovan and the Bloomberg administration was leaving, but we had an opportunity to get some of that federal money and all the work that went on the Lower East Side. So these are really challenging issues, trying to figure out how to be resilient, how to make sure the community is satisfied, and at the same time, how to pay for it all. And I'm very aware of the hardship. I see Catherine there. She's like the mother of resiliency on the Lower East Side. I just want you to know, and in the financial district. So we need a more resilient Lower Manhattan, and I look forward to ongoing discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Borough President. Marcia.
I have actually two questions. The first has to do with environmental concerns. Clearly, you're going to have to put landfill of some kind. Yes. Around the coastline in order to build it up. Are there any environmental concerns, the fish, the snail darter, all these things that have been raised in the past that could have an effect on how much landfill, where you can put it, et cetera?
So I want to say, Marcia, there's always real environmental issues that have to be grappled with. And I never take that lightly. But I also want to remind people this is an existential threat, and we have to deal with it aggressively. So one of the things we talk about in this plan is the difference between a traditional permitting process, which could take many, many years and slow our ability to protect hundreds of thousands of people, versus an expedited process that still very honestly looks at those environmental issues, but is much less bureaucratic, much more urgent. You know, this is a call to action. And so, yeah, we have to be mindful of the environment, but I would honestly say we cannot have the endless, dragging on that usually accompanies something of this scale. We're trying to tell people this is a very, very real threat, and we have to move now.
So my second question has to do with how you're going to pay for it. I know you'd like to have the federal government do it. You want to get the ball rolling.
Yep.
Will you be able to put city money into it? And tell us. So
sure.
I'm going to pay for it by X.
We're going to start with city money for sure. So the next phases of design, the work that we have to do to get started, that will be done with city money. We are going to appeal to the federal government for the reasons I stated. I don't think it's like the easiest argument in the world. Why is this a national asset that has to be protected? When you think about the words national security, what is more important than protecting Lower Manhattan? Right? But we spend tens of billions a year on foreign wars, but there's no money to protect Lower Manhattan, to protect the biggest city in the country. That makes no sense. So I believe this is an argument that can be won, and the best kind of protection would come from a plan with a lot of federal funding. If we can't get that federal funding, we have to have an honest conversation with the community, with the people of the city about the choices. It's not something that could be fully funded with city dollars. It just couldn't be. There's too many other demands. We would have to then either perhaps get state dollars, which you and I would both say don't flow abundantly nowadays, or have some mix of private development in the initiative to help pay for it.
So would that mean if you had to get private development, would that mean that you might be building things on this land.
Yes.
And since you have to go 2 blocks out,
Yeah.
I mean, you could build streets with buildings and
Yes, you
things
could.
like that. Is that something that would be, you know,
It's
under
possible.
consideration if you had to do it?
It's possible, but again, so one, there's going to be a whole very intense community process, as I said, ULURP, et cetera, to envision what the community would like to see. But it also, there's going to be an honest discussion of how do we pay for these protections. And this is what I think will happen. You know, we have all watched these discussions play out in neighborhoods all over New York City. And I understand how fiercely people protect their quality of life and the things they love in the neighborhood. But this will be very, I think, telling that folks never want to see the destruction they saw with Sandy again. And I think that's going to be the #1 imperative. So how we balance all that, how we make realistic choices. We need to do this. We need to do this quickly. It's going to cost, again, $10 billion. We have to come up with the money. My job, all of our jobs, is to have, to create a federal government, to vote for a federal government, to push a federal government to do this as they should, not only for New York City, they should be doing it for Miami, they should be doing it for Charleston, they should be doing it for cities all over the country. But in the meantime, we can't sit still. Did you want to add?
Yeah, absolutely. I think fundamentally we're looking at this from a resiliency perspective. Fundamentally, we're looking at this from a resiliency perspective. That is what drove this analysis. That is what this is about. It's about collectively protecting Lower Manhattan. That is all we're focused on. Ultimately, we're going to look at alternatives here, but there's a wide range of possibilities. 50 feet is a much less significant extension than 500 feet. Again, the 500 feet limit is what's set by the Coast Guard and the Army Corps because of the bulkhead line, but it's our objective to make this as minimal an impact on the community as possible while still providing the protection, but ultimately there's a question of funding as well.
Wait, you want to go ahead, man.
Mayor, Sandy happened in 2012.
Yeah.
Why did it take 6.5 years to come up with this plan, which you now say yourself will take years to implement?
Because the plan that was on the table, we came to realize was going to take way too long and was actually the wrong solution for a lot of the areas of the Manhattan shoreline. Rather than have the original vision of Seaport City, which was very private development heavy, which extended a very substantial way along the East River, we came to the realization we could do more and more quickly without that kind of intensive development. As James just said, our focus is not private sector development, as I think it was more in the previous administration. Our focus is resiliency. So we came up with a plan that is in most of its areas quicker and easier to implement. We came up with a plan also that addresses more problems, because it turns out, you know, and this is not a criticism, it's just everyone in the aftermath of Sandy was thinking about how to defend against a Sandy. Turns out there's a whole lot of other challenges we have to defend against in terms of this kind of resiliency. So this plan had to take a lot more into account and come up with the way to protect each part of the shoreline, and we found it was very different for each part of the shoreline. This piece around the Seaport, around the financial district, is unfortunately the worst of all worlds, because it is where there are so many jobs, subway lines, everything we talked about, people more and more living there, and it's the lowest part of the whole shoreline. So it's the most vulnerable, and that's why we need this extraordinary barrier.
Yeah, so we're talking about a 100-year solution here for what our projections of what storms are going to be like in 2100. And the science and information has evolved significantly since Sandy. Our analysis shows that Lower Manhattan by 2100 will be flooded daily 20% of the streets. So if you're in Lower Manhattan,
If you don't take action.
if we don't do anything, 20% of Lower Manhattan will be flooded every day. And that's new science that came out of our analysis. So we want to make sure is we're designing the protections that actually address the most current science. Because if we design protection based on old science, we're not going to be solving for the most current known challenges. Of course, climate science is always evolving, and we'll hear more from our friends about that tomorrow. But it's critically important that we be constantly on top of the most current information. And I would also add, it's really significant that we were able to come up with a solution for 2 bridges, which is deployable barriers. The Bloomberg administration did a lot of really great and important work immediately following Sandy, and I think it set a really important foundation. But it was a framework. It was a way of thinking about the different solutions, and the solution that they had identified for the area from the Battery almost to the Manhattan Bridge was to build in water development. The great thing about what the mayor said, to elaborate on it, is we identified deployable barriers for almost 50% of that area, meaning we don't have to go in the water at all for that amount, and we can start construction on that within the next 2 years. So that's a really enormous difference. It means we'll have almost half of that area protected by 2023 as opposed to by 2030. That's an enormous step in the right direction. And the reality is we went through a comprehensive analysis of every possible alternative for that remaining 50% of that area, and there's just no viable alternative but to build in the water. Why? Because it's 8 feet above sea level, and we're expecting 6 feet of sea level rise by 2100. Why? Because the Battery tunnel is less than 6 feet below the ground, and the AC tunnel are also between the surface and the bedrock, which you have to drive any deployable barriers into. It's a very complex area. There's no easy solution. We had to do a comprehensive look at the science and all of the alternatives, and we came to the conclusion that none of us wanted to come to, which is we have to do something in the water or this area will never be protected.
Okay, who hasn't gone? Dave?
This plan of building into the East River, have you run it by any of the property owners?
That was Mayor de Blasio discussing his plans to make Lower Manhattan storm-proof. His proposal, which could cost up to $10 billion, includes fortifying coastal areas like the South Street Seaport and Financial District with grass mounds and removable barriers to defend against incoming storms. Right now, we're taking a quick break, but coming back, we'll have more news ahead. Stay with CBSN New York.